Okay, so Kurt, could you go ahead and mute yourself?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, hello everyone. My name is Julie Yak, and I'm your hostess for a little while, but you're here mostly to listen to Jim. So I'll have a few announcements and then we'll move ahead. As we just said a minute ago, this is our first user group meeting using Teams. Hopefully they've had a chance to clear up those idiosyncrasies that made this really time prohibitive. So hopefully we'll be able to blaze through that and continue on using Teams. They're making it harder and harder for us to use Skype for Business. Teams is the push. So as I said, we are recording today. We'll post this on our event page on our website, as well as send out a tweet once that gets posted. We're always looking for speakers. I just did a push. We've got a few meetings that have been scheduled, including this one. So if there's something you'd like to share with us, let us know. We love to help new talent get out there and share the word. And then also, if there's a topic you're interested in learning and you haven't seen us cover it, let me know and we'll try to get that scheduled as well. Between the group that manages this organization, we're pretty good at finding people that have those skills that you're looking for. So just ask. So coming up next in August will be Mike and Aiden talking about Flow. I know that we're all dabbling in Flow and that we're waiting for full feature parity, and we're getting closer and closer. But anytime we have the chance to put Flow in front of our audience of developers, I'd love to do so. So we'll have that meeting in August. Conferences that are going on or have just happened. There was Business Application Summit in Atlanta, and I was there. It was, I think, a great, well-energized event. We've got the Australia Summit with Dynamic Communities coming up, as well as the Power Platform World Tour with Dynamic Communities. Those are all, I believe, paid events. Dynamic Communities has always been very supportive. It's in their name. And so they've got great content and great speakers. We've got Inspires happening this week in Las Vegas. I know several folks that are there, and there's been a push for some Dynamics conversations. I will be at the Dynamic Community Summit in Orlando in October, and I will probably be at Ignite. If you're at these events and want to hang out, by all means, drop me a line. Would love to say hi and meet anybody. We've got community days coming up, many of them, and there's not a single overarching organization. There are a few collective groups that are being organized. The CRM Saturdays have evolved to 365 Saturdays and some Fridays. I know that I'll be speaking at the one in Victoria at the end of September. We've got the 365 Power Up events, which are just getting off the ground. There's a group of MVPs and other interested folks that are trying to organize for people to give them a list of best practices and hopefully give them a platform. The Dynamics Power events are being posted currently on the 365 Saturday website. We've got App in a Day that are happening all over the place. Jim, I know that you delivered one of those. Our team is the team that authors and maintains the App in a Day content. So we're seeing those delivered all over the place. If you know of any other community events, by all means, let us know. We'd love to publicize that for you. We're all volunteers here, so we're all about the community. And with that, I'm going to pass off to Jim. He is one of our new additions to the MVP program. 2019 is his first year, but we've known him around the group for a little while. And as I said, he's delivered App in a Day. He helped my organization with some of that. And if you have any questions, by all means, take yourself off mute and chat with Jim. If you want to put something in the meeting chat panel, I'm happy to relay that message. And with that, Jim, I'm going to let you take over, and then I'll mute myself once I hear you.
Sounds good.
Perfect.
Everybody hear me okay?
Great.
Awesome. Yeah, I totally agree with Julie. The community events are awesome. It's a fantastic way to learn, and there's definitely more coming up. Did the App in a Day, there's Flow in a Day, there's more material coming out, so I definitely recommend getting on that. Yeah, so I'm going to share here real quick. Let me see if I can do it without breaking stuff. Let's see if I can do. Where's the sharing in Teams, by the way?
It should be in that toolbar in the middle of your screen.
Yeah, I see device settings, full screen keypad. Do I have to be added as a presenter?
I
Oh,
don't think so, but
never.
let's
No,
try.
there it is. It's on the wrong button. Thank you.
It's the one that
Uh,
does not look like a share button.
yeah, it looks like a download button.
Yep,
Exactly.
it's that one.
Yeah, so let me share my desktop and let me kick these off. Today I wanted to talk about a recent presentation I put together on, let me hit present. Let's see if this comes up. Can everybody see my slides? Or these
Yep,
slides?
we can see the presenter view of your slides, so your notes and whatnot.
Okay.
So unless you're talking trash in your notes, I don't know how much it matters.
No, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just pull this up. I turned off.
There we
It's
go.
switching screens on me.
Yep.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
Let me back up a little bit. That's me. Wanted to talk about Dynamics and SharePoint. It's been around for ages. If you've worked with Dynamics 365 back to CRM 2011, I believe is when they had the first release of integration between the two. They're very complementary technologies, and most projects I work on has some sort of we want to work with documents requirement. So we've integrated them on a lot of different projects. I'm saying we collectively because I'm sure I'm not alone here. But there's some limitations to the integration out of the box. So how can we extend them? Is kind of what I wanted to talk about. This is driven from a recent project I worked on where, and that's me. We talked about me before, and you see my smiling face. And we had a project that had some pretty extensive requirements around generating documents, moving them to SharePoint, and doing a lot of work on the documents in between. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk about this. But first, why integrate them in the first place? This is an old slide that I've had for quite a while, but it does a great job talking about why would you integrate the two systems. So I'm totally stealing this. This isn't my content. We've had it around for a long time. You may have seen it in years past, but it does a great job talking about the two complementary platforms. And by the way, if I go too fast, if you want me to stop, feel free. As Julie said, just chime in and interrupt me. So we got two platforms. Microsoft owns both of them, obviously. I'm assuming everybody here is familiar with SharePoint and Dynamics, but they're complementary, as we said. So one of the first things you hear people talk about with SharePoint versus Dynamics, the first thing people ask is, why would I use one versus the other? Well, what are the strengths of each and what are the weaknesses of each? So Dynamics, if you're familiar with it, is good for structured relational data, as it says. It's a relational database with a really killer user interface on top of it. It's one of the ways I look at it. SharePoint is typically more unstructured. It's become more structured over the years, but that seems to be through a lot of API extensions. But it's really good at storing unstructured and kind of loosely coupled data. So those are two complementary ways of storing information. The other thing that SharePoint does well that Dynamics doesn't necessarily do well is social engagement and collaboration. That's kind of the platform as a whole. It's a collaboration platform. Let's get together and work on some stuff. Where CRM seems to be, I mean, they offer up some ways of sharing across teams and collaborating on records, but a lot of it is driven by, you have to do this work. Here's a record for you to work on, get to it. So that's kind of a lot of the solutions I've seen, where CRM is very focused on you getting in and working on a record, while SharePoint is meant for, let's all get together and work on things as a team. And with that, I like the explanation here on SharePoint for information evolution and storage. It kind of threw me when I first looked at the slide again, and I had to think about what they mean by evolution. But I think of a document. You upload a document. We want to collaborate on it. It starts out as a certain format, certain bit of data in this document, whether it's Excel or Word or a PowerPoint presentation, and it evolves over time as you all collaborate. So I thought that was a nice phrase for capability in SharePoint, is evolving data as you work on it. CRM seems to more be about, I'm going to collect some data and I'm going to put it into a structured format so that I can go do some reporting on it or do some analytics downstream. So two different kind of intentions behind the platforms. Informal rules, so the rules workflow behind the scenes with it too is formalized processes versus more informal stuff happening there. I'm not real good with workflows in SharePoint, so I don't have a lot of good examples, but Dynamics CRM has a lot of very structured, very formal workflow rules like business process flows, business rules, old school workflows, and now they're extending it with flow. SharePoint, again, if somebody has a really good example of an informal workflow, please chime in. But those are two different sort of opposing views of workflows in the two different platforms. Enterprise search, SharePoint does a great job of that, and there's tons of different third-party tools around it. While Dynamics CRM has some enterprise search capabilities, it's mainly for data. It's mainly the situations I've seen are driven by, I need to get in and see the work that I'm working on. What are the records I'm responsible for and I'm working on a regular basis. Whereas SharePoint is, I'm searching against a whole bunch of stuff and content within these documents. So it does a great job at that, as well as, again, all the third-party integrations that tie it together with other solutions. And the kind of the security mindset between the two, Dynamics CRM starts off as very restrictive. A person owns a record, and they expanded it to be team ownership as of 2011. Whereas SharePoint, again, the intention is, hey, everybody, let's work on stuff. So you can do a lot of collaboration in both, but the initial capabilities are driven by locking things down in Dynamics versus SharePoint. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good overview of why you would choose one over the other, but you can integrate the two and get the best of both worlds. So if I have Dynamics CRM, but I want to do collaboration on documents, let's say I'm a product I worked on in the past where they had taskers and it was, hey, let's get a team together to work on this one project. We had a lot of collaboration deliverables with documents. We had both. So we had the Dynamics CRM record that tracked the details about the project they're working on, the task, versus SharePoint, which were the deliverables that everybody on the assigned task can collaborate on. So out of the box, Dynamics and SharePoint are integrated out of the box. And if you've worked on it, this should look familiar. This is a really nice presentation. I found it, a link I'll share later from a post where somebody explained this. It's configurable point and click configuration between the two systems. And out of the box, you can just go into a CRM, your administrative console, and you say, I want to do integration with SharePoint. You choose which entities you want to configure, which we see at the top. We have the entity record, which will then say, whenever you create a new record for this, it'll create a new document library bound to this site. So out of the box, you can point and click. A system administrator, no code, can integrate the two very easily and have a record by record document library match, right? So for every record in a system, let's say a case, for example, which we'll look at in a minute, I can have a whole document library which is completely focused on that case. So the pros of this out of the box is great. It's point and click. I don't have to be a developer to do this. There's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes that I just get with a few configuration elements. You get the built-in user interface elements too. It shows right up on my case record, which again, we'll see in a few. You get the shared logins. So I've got access to Dynamics. I've got a Dynamics license. I've got access to this document library if you're using the Office 365 authentication. And again, as I mentioned, no code required. The cons of it, the downside, the limitations of it is the security is not transferable. And what I mean by that is I may have, let's say, a case, and I've got very restrictive security around it. Like I only want certain people or certain people on a team to see the case because it's got sensitive information in it. That doesn't transfer over to the document library. If it's in SharePoint and you've got access to SharePoint, you can typically see this information. So you don't have configurable, transferable security. Naming convention, this is just a personal pet peeve. It uses some really long strings and it's kind of cryptic if you go in and look at SharePoint. So it's a little bit frustrating there. A little bit of a pet peeve, but it can become pretty important if you've got end users looking at SharePoint. And then you've got the potential for orphan files. Unless I've missed a release, you delete the case that's associated with the library remains. So if that's been changed, definitely let me know. But as last I checked, I don't believe it'll clean up your SharePoint library whenever you delete a record. You can build some code to do this, but it's an example of you have to extend the platform to do it. So why extend it? So what we just talked about, some of the cons are why we would extend it. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to chime in. I know I'm going a little bit fast here. So why extend the integration? So what we just talked about, some of the cons are why we would do it. So what if I want to, in addition to just having a document library, I want to have an entire template for that library on creation of the record and the related library. For example, I want to maybe put in some template documents as part of that library. So when they open up the case, they've got some templates they can fill out and it's just readily available. As I mentioned, we can map between the CRM and SharePoint security models. If I want to, I can write some code to say that I'm going to grant access to only the people who are related to the CRM record in SharePoint, and you can extend that with a bit of code through the SDK on both. And I can relate an entire site to a CRM record as opposed to just the document library. What if you want to have a full collaboration for this record? I can extend that through code as well. I could also apply some workflows and some automation. One of the things we'll talk about in a minute, the example I'll go through is I've got capabilities of storing documents in CRM through notes and note attachments. Well, we may have SharePoint integration, but people may still be attaching things to notes, or may have some processes which do that automatically. Well, I can write some code, which we'll go into the example here, to move those over and put them into the related SharePoint library. I can, and this is the example we'll go to, I can generate some reports programmatically, and I can move them over to SharePoint. Let's say I get an SSRS report that I can generate, and I want to run it on a periodic basis. Let's say it's a quarterly report against sales numbers. I can move that over to the team associated within SharePoint. And I can also go and look at SharePoint to evaluate what's going on in SharePoint and do some work in Dynamics. For example, one of the projects I worked on, we had some code that would go in on a trigger, look into the SharePoint library and see if there were any documents in there that had a digital signature. And then it would do some work in Dynamics based on that criteria. So there was some pretty cool stuff they did that it was leveraging the out-of-the-box configuration using the document libraries. I had to link between the two records, the CRM library or CRM record and the SharePoint library, and I can go evaluate that related document library. So those are just some examples. I'm sure there's many, many more, and probably people on the call have had some experience with them, but those are just a handful that we'll dive into with a demo here in a few. So to extend them, the whole point of this talk is what methods can we use to extend them? We can use CRM workflows, we can use CRM custom workflow activities, we can use plugins, we can use web services, we can use all kinds of stuff that has access to both the CRM SDK and the SharePoint SDK. So I chose Function Apps. On this previous project I mentioned, we use Function Apps to go in and put in some custom logic that we wanted to apply to extend the integration. And as I mentioned, one of them was moving files between the two systems from a note to SharePoint. So I chose Function Apps, and what are functions? If you're not familiar with them, another definition I totally stole from a really good blog post about it, which I have in the links, is it allows you to run small units of code in a very isolated fashion. And they're basically, it's serverless and stateless. So the two keywords that really stand out, because I can have full-blown web services, whether they're REST endpoints or WCF endpoints, all kinds of really complex stuff, or I can just have this little bit of code that I want to run on demand, and that's where the serverless and stateless bit comes in. The other real cool thing is they have built-in triggers. Just a couple of them that are right off the documentation is, HTTP trigger, a queue, or a timer. And by HTTP, which we'll get into a demo of, you can trigger this just through a web call. I can go to a URL and initiate this function app call. The other benefit versus a full-blown app service, let's say again a REST endpoint that's going to sit there as an app service, is cost. So function apps are cost per execution as opposed to other app services that have a cost for uptime. They have to be up and running. Think of it as a Azure hosted IIS site, for example. If you're on premise in a data center, you've got to have a server running IIS and it's going to handle these requests. Well, with a function app, it's just available whenever you need it. And looking at the cost model, if you have fewer than X number of calls, and I believe the number is like 400,000 calls or some crazy huge number, it could actually be free depending on your deployment, as opposed to app services, which may not have very many calls. You're just going to pay for that uptime. So it's a real nice, low cost and easy deployment option for deploying your code. Well, the other part of this too, the other bit you might need to extend is one limitation we have, and I don't think I put it in the slide, is if I want to run and use third-party components. For example, working on a project right now where we need to call out to iText, which is a PDF management tool. I can't run that in a sandbox environment in just a regular plugin or a workflow, a custom workflow activity. So putting in function apps out there allows you to deploy any third-party tools through NuGet or your own assemblies without using IO merge. So let's go through a real quick demo and see where I am on time. I think I've still got a little bit of time left.
Oh, you're great. You've got 40 minutes or so if you need it.
Okay, cool. All right, good. I know I was talking kind of fast, but I can't see my clock on the screen right now. Cool. So let's go through an example to kind of see how all the things fit together. As I was working on this, I was putting together the slides and the code and the demo, I was focused on CRM and function apps. And then I started looking into how I want to implement this example. And I thought, well, I can use Flow too. As Julie mentioned, Flow is really coming along. And most of the work that I do personally is in the government. So we have the GCC, which is the government cloud. I don't know why they call it GCC. That's an acronym I have to look up. But it's the Microsoft Government Cloud. And they finally started releasing the Power Platform into the GCC. So now we've got access to function apps. And function apps, Flow, and Power Platform capabilities. So I started thinking about this, and I decided to use Flow as a part of this demo. So kind of putting together a very quick, kind of contrived demo that demonstrates all these moving parts. Let's say I have a Word template, right, which we have out of the box because I'm being a little bit lazy in my demo. There's a Word template that already has a report style template based on a case record. When I generate a Word template using a workflow, the first thing it does, and the only thing it does, is throws it into a note and attaches it to the case. I'm like, that's really cool, but I want to store my stuff in SharePoint. So let's say, for the purposes of a demo, that I want to generate this report from that Word template and it's attached to a note, but I want to move that over to SharePoint. So I've got a case record which is already configured. There's the CRM SharePoint integration already configured on my environment. So I've got a document location and I've got SharePoint set up, and I've got this template. So we can go in.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Are you intending to be sharing your screen? Because right now we still see your PowerPoint.
Yeah, I'm going to jump over to it real quick.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that you were still.
No, we'll get there. We'll get there in a minute. I just wanted to walk through the scenario and kind of what's our problem and solution, right? So as I mentioned, I started working out with just the function apps and a workflow, and then I using Flow in the middle saved me some time. So we want to generate this document, have a note we created, and I want to move that over to SharePoint. And when it's done, this is the part where Flow really made it easy, is I want to email the user that created the document. So our proposed solution is use the Word template, and I created a workflow, a one-line workflow, which we can look at if you want to, and it just goes and generates the template, generates the Word document from the template and attaches it to a note. I set up a flow that can go in and trigger on a note creation, and then it'll invoke this function app that I created. So I created a function app, then we'll go in and go out and grab the CRM data that's passed in through some configuration, which we'll look at. It'll upload the document to SharePoint using the SDK, using the CSOM SDK for SharePoint, and then it'll go in and update some fields on the document. This is the other bit of it too, which actually I just realized I forgot to mention, is I actually want to update the metadata on the SharePoint document to show some fields from CRM. So if I only ever have access to SharePoint, I can look at the document that was uploaded and see some information about the CRM record it's related to. And then when we're done, email using Flow. So real simple scenario and a relatively simple solution. and very little code that goes into this. And we'll go into it in a minute. I'll show you the code, I'll show you the flow, and we'll walk through real quick. And here's just a visual on the stuff we just talked about. I'm going to run a workflow that creates a document, attaches it to the note. The flow triggers, it's going to call out to my function app, which is running in Azure. It's going to then go in and call the SDK to grab some stuff from CRM, move some stuff to SharePoint, and then update some data. And it's then also going to call the flow is going to then trigger again to do the check the response and email the owner. So with that, we'll jump into the demo real quick. Got to have my obligatory monkey picture. So let's see. Let me pull up CRM real quick, and we'll just walk through and see if it works. So we have, are you seeing, cool. Are you still seeing my screen?
Yes, we've got a list of active cases.
Cool, I see the red outline, so I'm assuming it's okay. So I talked real fast there, but let's jump in real quick, and I'm just gonna pick one that I was looking at earlier, and I pick a case. And these are the best kind of demos where I can use what's already been created and I don't have to do a lot of work. So standard stuff, we get a case. This is all demo data that comes with my instance. And I'm going to run a workflow that I created, which is a one-line CRM workflow. And I like that it shows up over here as a flow, not just a CRM workflow. And what this will do is, we can jump into it if you'd like to look at it in the solution, but it's a one-line workflow that says, run this template on this case. So there's not a lot to see. And if I do it properly, it was taking a little bit of time to run earlier when I was testing. What this will do is this will go in and we should see a note get created here on our timeline. Cool. So I get a note and it's going to show me this case summary. And let me just open it up real quick. It's really not a lot to it. It's kind of boring. It just should show some case information. This is out of the box stuff. And it shows a case and just spits out some information. This can be as complex as we like. If you've worked with Word templates, you get a lot of capabilities there. But I was using some of the stuff that was already there because it was easy. So let's see if it actually ran. What we should see over here once the workflow runs, once the flow kicks off, and it takes a moment, it's taking a little bit of time to spin up when I was looking at it earlier. Let's see if it's running. 9 seconds ago, cool, it succeeded. So I should see over here. Cool. So I've got a document. This just popped up, and by magic, of course. And let me open up the document. There's my document. Let's see if the content is okay, because that always works best whenever you actually have the document content. When I first started messing with flow and moving documents around, I was moving empty documents around, which is not very helpful. So cool, the document's over in SharePoint. You can see this being loaded from my SharePoint instance. The document itself looks to be working well. And where's my location? One of the other things that I did in my my code is I moved over some case information into SharePoint. So here's a situation where, you know what, I have some licensed people in Dynamics, but I have some people who have access to SharePoint and not Dynamics. I can easily come into this document that's been uploaded. I can see the case title and case number. Those are just additional attributes, which I just picked kind of randomly. I can say, well, this case summary is related to that case number, and I can filter and sort on that kind of stuff. And so how's that done? It was a pretty simple. Oh wait, I missed a bit. Let's see if I got the email. Cool. So my email shows me. I can download. I sent myself a link, and oh, my time zone is still on the West Coast. But I got a link to the document that. Cool. That allows me to upload it. Let me overwrite the other one and make sure that the content looks good there too. So me being the person that initiated the workflow, I'm going to get emailed whenever that completes. So you can see all my other testing in here, all the super successful tests that I ran. So how does it work? So all those bits we talked about, as I mentioned, I won't really go into the workflow in Dynamics because it doesn't do a whole lot. The real work starts with flow, and it's actually relatively simple. My flow, if you've worked with flow, you can see it's only a couple of bits. There's really not a lot to it, but it's actually doing a lot of work. It's pretty powerful stuff. So I'm having a trigger that's going to fire off on a new note being created. Now, Downside of this, again, it's a demo, but you'll see that it's going to trigger on any note, and I don't really have any other logic going on to check that it's notes that I care about, right? I can do an additional check in the flow to say, is it related to a case versus another, the regarding field kind of stuff. So it's a very straightforward demo. It just triggers on all notes. If I created one on another entity, would do some work as well. But again, working with flow, you all know that you'll put in some additional stuff here. And whenever it's the first thing I do here is I'm going to grab the related user so I can email them later. So I'm grabbing and I'm going to throw it into get the created by off of the related note and just throw that into a value called related user. And then here's the cool part. So I can call a function app right from Flow using an HTTP action. And this is the part that I was a little bit confused by. I'm able to pass in, when I first started working on this, I wanted to be able to pass in a call a function app. And the thing that we'll talk about in a moment when I get into the function app is I can pass in some parameters like the node ID right in as a JSON blob of text right into the body of the post. And it's just with a couple of bits of configuration. This is the most complicated part. I get this from the function app definition so that it knows what function app I'm calling, and it's the unique key. And then that's it. It just basically, it's as if I'm calling it from code, I'm calling it from Flow. I'm just going to invoke this function app. And the result that comes back, my function app, I have complete control over what I send back. And I put together the schema. It's pretty simple. I pass back a URL. This is something I define. I have a URL and a file name so that I can say, hey, I'm going to take the body of this. I'm going to parse it out, get the URL for the file, get the name, and then pass that into an email. And then again, just click, click, click. I have point and click configuration here so far. I've done no development work, no code here. And I'm able to pass this off and send the email out to the user. Again, relatively straightforward. You can see there isn't a lot of error checking or anything like that, but it demonstrates some pretty powerful capabilities of Flow. When I first started the demo, I mentioned that it's evolved into using Flow because I was going to put together a custom workflow activity to call this endpoint and then grab the results. And then I realized, hey, I could do this without writing any code. Then it's always good as a developer. So that's the Flow. Now, what's the function app that we're calling? Let me open up Visual Studio real quick. If you're not familiar with it, hopefully this should be, if you're not a developer and you're not real familiar with Flow, it should actually still be fairly straightforward. I created this using a standard template in Visual Studio. I created a new function app call Visual Studio project, and my type was HTTP. So it put in all the HTTP trigger information for us, and it gave me a starting point for the code. And in fact, you can see the template that it gives you is pretty cool. It tells you how to give your response back, how to get some parameters. It does some work for you. So it's kind of cool. There's a lot of stuff out there if you're not super familiar with function apps to get started. This doesn't do any authentication either. So I left this open. All I need is the key and I can call this. So on function apps, you have lots of options around authentication, just like any other app service. I can use Azure Active Directory. I can use third-party integrations like Facebook even. I can restrict it using CORS to say only accept requests from certain URL domains. I can do a lot of stuff around authentication. And here, I just didn't do anything for the purposes of the demo. But that would be the first thing you look at is how do I lock this down so people can't just go in and do stuff with my function app. Internally, I'm storing the information to call out into Dynamics. This is something that you could typically throw into like Key Vault. So Azure has an entire mechanism for storing super secure stuff called Key Vault. So I would put all of these things that you're seeing here. If you want to try to get in there, you can guess my password. If you do that, that'd be kind of funny. But I'm storing my credentials in here to connect to CRM. And now what this will do, this function app, what I mentioned earlier is, it'll go out and I'll say, okay, I've got some information passed in. We saw the incoming information. And some of them I didn't pass in. I can pass in all kinds of stuff. And these are just things I was thinking about whenever I was designing it. But I pass in a note ID and that I'm interested in. Here's the note that was triggering this call. And I can pass that in using parameters. And up here, whenever I get the parameters, I retrieve that using my custom object that I know what it looks like. So I get those parameters, and then I want to connect to Dynamics, and I'm going to go grab the node information, get some details about the node, and then I'm going to make a call to SharePoint, passing over the content of the node, the document body from the node, and then I'm going to update update the SharePoint object once I'm done with some parameters about the related case. So there again, once again, this is my disclaimer that it's a demo. You'd have to do a lot more error checking for the relations. You know, am I related to a case versus another type of entity? Should you ever get here, if you're not in the situation you want to be in. But error checking is pretty sparse in this, so feel free to harass me a little bit later as part of the hazing about my error checking. But you saw that it works, so I think we're good. This check right here was the one morning when I first was going to do the demo. Flow was down, so it wasn't calling into my app. It was totally flaking out. Dynamics was down. Sorry, not Flow, but Dynamics was down. So there was a little bit of troubleshooting I did there. But if you look at the code, it's relatively straightforward. So even if you're not a developer, let me zoom in a little bit if you're having trouble seeing this too. Close that out. So basically, all I'm going to do here is the standard stuff. If you're a CRM developer, you should be familiar with the CRM service client. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to invoke a new connection to Dynamics. I'm going to retrieve the annotation using the note that was passed in. So I'm just going to go grab that annotation object. And I want to get all the columns just because there aren't very many on a note. I'm just going to grab them all. I'm going to get the file name from the file name attribute in CRM. And I'm going to get the document body attribute. And I'm going to grab the text of that and convert it into a string. We'll log some stuff. There's lots and lots of options for logging, which is a really nice thing about function apps as well. There's lots of capabilities for integrating into Azure logging. That's a whole other talk. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to grab the regarding information here. And again, I'm assuming that this is related to a case. If I trigger on another one, this will probably blow up. But I'm going to grab the incident information. So that's our case. Get the case number and the title. So there's some values. And then I'm going to, this is a bit, I'm going to leverage the out-of-the-box integration. So for my case, go get the regarding document location, or sorry, go get the related document location for SharePoint, so I know what folder to dump it into. And this is just a little helper function. We can dive into in a minute if you'd like, but basically give me the URL to the document library in SharePoint. And that's all stored in Dynamics configuration. There we're leveraging the out-of-the-box CRM SharePoint integration. And we're just extending it a little bit. So once I have that, cool, I've got my notes. I've got the document body, the document that was attached to it, stored as this base 64 string. I've got some information about the case. And then what I want to do is now I want to connect to SharePoint. And there's a really good set of, a really cool set of libraries allow you to connect the, what is it? CSOM, it's client object model. I'm missing what it client-side object model. So it allows you to connect programmatically as opposed to using a whole bunch of other REST-based endpoints, which get a little bit tough. This is a very, very easy way to go in and connect to SharePoint and navigate and do some work against it, execute some functions. And all I'm doing here is, I'm connected to CRM, I'm going to connect to SharePoint. I'm going to pass in my credentials. I'm going to go connect and make sure that I'm okay there. I'm going to go get the folder context. I'm going to load them up. So this is the syntax. It's a little bit quirky. It took me a little bit to get used to. I'm going to execute some queries against SharePoint. So I grab some information back from the server. I'm going to get the list of folder items. And what I want to do is upload this file and dump it to the server. So I basically have execute query, load the folder, and then I'm going to do my create file info. So I basically put together this object that represents the file. And you can see it's the file data is the body of the document. Here's the target URL, and that just goes and uploads it right up to SharePoint. So that's the cool part of in a couple of lines of code. There's a little bit more to it, and this is something we probably wrap up into some helper functions, make it a little bit easier to read, but I can pretty easily just take the body of a document and dump it into SharePoint. This is something that's real useful. It may be coming from a note, it may be coming from an upload from a portal, let's say, and maybe moving things back and forth between Azure Blob storage, but here's some capabilities in SharePoint that are pretty cool. And once it's been uploaded, I'm going to go and grab a list. I'm going to grab the file that I just created, which is a list item under the hood, and I'm going to update these two attributes. And I have some helper functions to make sure that those attributes exist. And then I'm going to put in the case title and title and number as attributes on the file. And then I'm going to check in the file. That's pretty much it. So this is kind of the equivalent of if I went in and I did file upload, I added the file, and then I wanted to SharePoint and I added some attributes, this is programmatically doing something that a user could do as well. And then I bring back, and I have another little simple bit of helper code to bring back the URL. And here's what I return the response. And this is pretty simple too. I'm just saying, build this little blob of JSON that I can consume in the function app. And this is the part that was really neat. So this is where I pass back the URL and file name of the file that I just created. And that's the response that I can parse out using this parse JSON action, which is really, really cool. It allows me to throw those values into variables that I can use in my email. And that's pretty much it. So in a couple of lines of code, you can see my function app is pretty sparse, and it could actually be refactored to be a bit cleaner, obviously, into some helper functions, but it's a fairly reusable bit of code and small bit of code that allows me to extend moving things around. Anytime somebody uploads this, runs this Word template and spits out this report, I can email it to the person and make sure that it's moved into SharePoint. I could add some additional logic in here. The other benefit we have with using function apps is, what if I wanted that as a PDF? You know, what if I wanted to convert that Word document to a PDF before uploading because I don't want them to modify it? I can go in and use a third-party tool. Like one example I'm working with right now is called iText, and it has some capabilities where you pass it a Word document, it renders a PDF, and that would allow me to go in and upload that as opposed to the actual document itself. So it gives a little bit of control over the content. I couldn't easily do that in a plugin or custom workflow activity because of the third-party dependencies. Online, I can't use IO merge anymore. It's just not supported. So we've got some limitations there that function apps allow us to get past. It's actually a real requirement we have. I could also go in and fill in some information in this document too. I'm not limited to just moving the file around. I can go in and modify the file if I wanted to do that as well, which would be pretty hard to do in a plugin or a custom workflow activity. So function apps, you can see that it's very simple. It's a very small bit of code. There's probably more just setting things up and connecting to things than there is actual logic happening, but it gives me a very, very small sort of self-contained function that I can reuse in different places. So that's pretty much it for the demo in terms of the code. And again, it worked out really well. I didn't have to write any code to do all the stuff that Flow is doing, which allowed me to do a couple of bits that I didn't really plan on. So with a couple of bits of code in a function app, a few steps in a Flow, I'm able to move documents between SharePoint and extend integration pretty weasily using a couple of bits of existing technology. Let me see. So there's some additional stuff we'll share the slide. A couple of the places where I got some good information about this when I was digging into the code. I just put into links here. There's a good bit about integration between 365 and SharePoint, Azure Functions, and then Azure Functions authentication, which is a pretty important part of what we're talking about. So with that, I'll just open it up to any questions anybody has.
Thank you so much for all of that, Jim. I really appreciate that. Anyone on the call here have any questions that you'd like to bring up? Usually that's a good sign, Jim. That means that you've covered all the bases. Do you have a text slide you can put up?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Do you have a slide with your contact information you could post?
I do. I'll send you the slides. This is my contact information that comes with my great picture. But yeah, feel free to drop me. I'm on LinkedIn. I've got my blog if you want to check it out. I plan on putting more details about this situation out there, the scenario out there, not situation. So keep an eye out for a blog post on this to get a little bit more into the details. One of the things I want to cover is authentication. I'm on Twitter, standard stuff. So feel free to drop me a line if you got any questions, suggestions, or even corrections. I'm always open to anything that might need to be done better or fixed.
So I appreciate your time so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And we'll see you in a few weeks when we've got Mike and Aiden. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.